Hello. How you doing there? Humans love to invent contrivances. You ever heard of the old saying about the fallacy of concept reification? Human beings are really, really good at that. We love doing it. I'd like for this to be a two-part, two-sectional of this video. One is about the nature of the ether, and of course, that it does exist. Of course, exists is a wrong word because exists comes from existence, which literally means to be outside of itself. In other words, as manifest. And of course, if the ether were manifest in itself, in its fundamental state, as it were, then it wouldn't be the ether by definition, since it's non-Cartesian. We could say anti-Cartesian or non-Cartesian. And as I've said before many times, and some people really fail to connect to it, this very, very simple fact that I'm all about making things really simple. Mother Nature is very simple, but she's not simplex. There's only ever been two assumed foundations of reality, and this is really important. You should ask your physics professor or teacher about this and see what the response is. Of course, you won't get a response, probably some sort of hubristic, and they puff themselves up. Only two foundations. One has been based upon atomism. Atomism is a very ancient concept. Like the whole universe is a bunch of bumping particles, conglomerations of particles, interacting particles, bumping particles. Completely impossible. Yeah? And the other one is a foundation for ultimate reality. It's based upon the ether. So there's only ever been these two postulated. One is completely logical, and the other one's completely impossible. Atomism can't work. Ask any scientist to define what a field is. And if they can't define a field, then trust me, they won't be able to define a field. So, well, excuse me, sir. You said the ether doesn't exist. That's right, the ether doesn't exist. So what's a field? Well, the field is marked by a series of points. These are lines of influence. Well, lines are concepts. A line is not a thing, Human beings, of course, we all have ideas of lines. Here's the line on the top of this computer. It's nice and straight. Of course, Mother Nature doesn't have any straight lines. There's not a single straight line in Mother Nature. Everything is curvilinear because all lines are as manifest due to magnetism. And the reason why they're curvilinear, that's a neat word everybody should learn, is because like a dog with a leash, with a chain that's tied to a stake in the ground, everything is staked at the plane of inertia, or in counter space. So the dog could run around, but it will run around in an ellipse. It's the reason why Mother Nature's lines are all curvilinear. All force vectors are three-dimensional S-curves. The actual extrapolation is kind of a donut shape. This is a golden apple. Extrapolation of a force vector, you can actually draw a three-dimensional S-curve right through this apple from one side to the other. And that, of course, is the force line of magnetism. But ask a scientist also to explain wireless power induction. It was the movement of power. It's the movement of electrons. Well, how does wireless power induction work in a vacuum? Wireless power induction, of course, is a reality. There are many countless patents based upon wireless power induction devices, including your toothbrush. We actually put it in, and I don't have my Apple Watch with me, but it uses a little induction charging device. If you actually lift it slightly off of the charger, just very slightly, it will still induce a charge. There's nothing passing from one end to the next. Any scientist has a really difficult time with the very, very simple things because they can never tell you what a field is. What's a field? Well, it's influence, region of influence. Oh, really? What are these regions? Region is another extrapolation, another conceptual reification. Here's some things that don't exist, by the way, in nature that human beings think do exist. And of course, they're nouns in the dictionary. Space. Space is not a thing at all. Space has no properties, as Nikola Tesla famously said. And the only time Nikola Tesla kind of foamed at the mouth was in his day. It was a serious issue. It was the reification of space as having properties, which Nikola Tesla said was impossible. And of course, he's correct. These are other things that don't exist. Emptiness, chaos, a shadow, time. Time doesn't exist at all. Time is only conventionally extant. It doesn't have any existence. It's only a measure of masses and magnitudes. It's a measure. Anything that partakes of time, of course, partakes of death, because anything that suffers or swims in the sea of time, not that time is a sea, undergoes death. That's the reason why in Chinese and Japanese and the word for number 4, I think some other languages, means death, because if you're subject to time, then you're subject to death. But from the perspective of a Mother Nature, time doesn't exist at all. Every ancient culture, as I've said this many times, said that time was the number 4. There's a reason for this, take a long time to explain. It's also the only number that doesn't exist between number 1 and 5 in the Fibonacci sequence, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5. Anyway, these oblong, obtuse concept reifications, kind of like ice, water, and steam. Well, ice, water, and steam, of course, are one and the same thing in a very simplex analogy, but human beings love to reify these concepts like chaos, and emptiness, and space, and time. None of these things actually exist. You know, they're attributional in nature and they're codependent for their manifestation, but they're not a thing in and of themselves. They have no principality. Human beings, especially those that are interested in field theory, and there are quite a few of those, love to talk about an ether vortex. And ether vortex, by the way, is just 1/2 of a hyperboloid. You know, this apple shape right here, this is a hyperboloid or a torus or a donut shape. If you actually cut it in half, you can see right here on the top of the apple we actually have this indentation that curves towards counter space, or the center of the apple, which of course is where we find the seeds. A vortex is just half of a torus. It is also, too, you call it half of a hyperboloid, because a hyperboloid is the negative image of a torus. Negative image of a torus is a hyperboloid. These are the conjugate geometries, respectively, of force of motion, inertia, and acceleration, respectively magnetic divergence and counterspatial convergence. Everybody loves to talk about electricity, and I'm going to give you a quote from Charles Proteus Steinmetz. Now, I don't know if you know who he was. He was, I think it was called an achondroplagic dwarf, which is a type of dwarfism. He was bent at the hip. His body was literally shaped like a boomerang. Yeah? Brilliant guy, smoked giant cigars, very small. There's a picture of him, by the way, in Thomas Edison, where he's leaned over a desk with a giant cigar, and they're looking at the, this is true story, by the way, they're looking at the drawings for a temporal communication device, basically a telephone that communicates through time. Fascinatingly enough, huh? Anyway, Charles Proteus Steinmetz perfected, through laminated sheet steel and other things, Nikola Tesla's AC generator. Charles Proteus Steinmetz was, I don't know if you're going to like this, but it's true, way more intelligent than Nikola Tesla. Charles Proteus Steinmetz had quite a few of his own patents. You probably never heard of them. Most of his books are available for free on archive.org. Anyway, his book, Electrical Discharges, Waves, and Impulses, I think it's page 13 or page 17, states specifically, this is 1917, here over 100 years ago, even then, over 100 years ago, he talks about all the people of his time being totally confused about electricity. If you actually understand what electricity is, explaining how an electromagnet works is incredibly easy. I don't know if you've ever seen those giant electromagnets that like pick up, you know, car husks and whatnot. They'll pick them up and they dump them for recycling. You ever seen the inside of them? They look like a coil. The way an electromagnet works is it sends an enormous amount of electricity through it, and all the dielectricity is discharged in a counter space, leading this enormous magnetic field. Electricity is a hybrid. You can find this in Electrical Discharges, Waves, and Impulses, too. Eric Dollard talks about this, but I mean, this is a fact. Electricity is not one of Mother Nature's fundamental field modalities. Electricity is a hybrid of dielectricity. And magnetism. Charles Proteus Steinmetz specifically goes on in much further detail and verbiage than I will here to say that people had conflated electricity and confounded it and made things, in his words, I think his exact words were overtly complicated. So when you actually understand what electricity is a hybrid of two different things, and you understand things a whole lot better. There's not an electrician on this earth, and I've literally heard from thousands of electricians, like, this is fascinating stuff. I downloaded that genius's book, Charles Proteus Steinmetz. I never learned any of this as an electrician. I've been an electrician for 20, 30, 40 years, and they didn't know any of this stuff. Because actually working on building and fixing stuff and electrical components doesn't require you to think. You just have to know how to do things accurately without shocking yourself or electrocuting yourself, obviously so. But as it pertains to field theory, this is an undeniable fact that electricians and people that design electrical devices, they don't have to know any of this stuff. Fundamentals of field theory is neither important nor is it taught. So that's a fascinating fact, by the way. Anyway, getting back to it, but the ether vortex is just half of a hyperbola. You could say half of a torus, if you will. It's just the vortex or the move towards counter space. It's the discharge of the after effect of a divergent magnetic field. Here's something very, very important, and this is so ludicrous, I have to emphasize the fact this is not me saying this. This is all the whole realm of quantum. Yeah, and there's no such thing as quantum. I point out to people, because everybody today loves to use the word quantum. Quantum this, quantum that. If you want to sound like a modern day person in academia, no. All you have to do is just insert the word quantum before every fourth word. I could pick up any book and just insert the word quantum before every fourth word. Quantum does not refer to anything at all. Neither Nikola Tesla, Charles Steinmetz, James Clerk Maxwell, Oliver Heaviside, none of these people made use of referring to field theory of Mother Nature, the word quantum, because it doesn't signify anything. Specifically, it's a reference to the smallest measurable quantity of observation. And these are manifestations of mathematicians who don't believe in anything that you cannot quantify. This is where the quantum realm sprang from, actually. So quantum has nothing to do with Mother Nature. It's the human conceptual reification to quantify phenomena in nice little segments so that we can count them and we can stick them and plug them into our equations. But getting back to the fundamental secrets of magnetism, and of course, like I said already, and I've said in many countless videos, there's only ever been two foundations presumed for the foundation of ultimate reality. One's based in atomism, as proposed by the cult of quantum, by relativity, and of course atomism is very ancient. I mean, you can read about the Greek atomists. They think that Mother Nature has a bag of magic particles and everything is either a conglomeration of particles or is a set series of interactions between particles. And of course it doesn't work that way. Everything is fields and fields are not particles, and the other one, of course, is the ether. The ether is undeniable. You can never explain a field. You can never explain EPR. You can never explain instantaneous action at a distance. You can't explain gravity. But these people, since they are atomists, and just like to a hammer, everything is a nail, to an atomist, everything is a particle, they will tell you flat out, and you can look this up, you can find it on Wikipedia, you can find it anywhere. Hey, what's going on in a magnet is the emission and interchange of virtual photons. Now, there's no such thing as a virtual photon. It's never been the observed input or output of any experiment ever done. But two magnets are accelerating towards one another, magnetic attraction. Of course, there's no such thing as magnetic attraction. This is the exchange of, these are their words, not mine. It's the exchange of virtual photons. If you believe that, you might be intelligent, but you're certainly not wise. That's a phantasm. There's no difference in saying virtual photons than there is saying leprechauns or unicorns or anything else completely ridiculous, like something ludicrous out of Lord of the Rings. Fundamentally, quantifiably, no different. There's no such thing as a virtual photon or a virtual particle. These do not exist, nor do these people, to their credit. Actually, some do say that they exist. But most of them say, we don't think these things exist, but they help the equations balance out. They will tell you that this is what's going, because, like I said, to a hammer, everything is a nail. To an atomist, everything is a particle. Well, how can we explain, since we don't believe in the ether? See, when you dismiss the ether, the fundamental pitfall, a bottomless pit, by the way, that happens is that you can't explain countless things. You can't explain what a field is. You can't explain gravity. You can't explain instantaneous action at a distance. Well, nothing travels faster than light. Nothing can happen instantaneously, but they know that it does. The EPR paradox. There's countless examples where there's instantaneous reaction and or mutual causation. And you can't explain that with atomism. Even if you were to concoct something as ridiculous as virtual photons. Well, nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. Even virtual photons can't. Therefore, nothing could happen instantaneously at a distance. Well, speed of light, of course, doesn't imply anything is moving. Of course, they will tell you that it does, but speed of light is the hysteresis of the ether, or the rate of induction. We all have the idea in our head of a speed of sound. Yes, and anything that has a speed must be moving from point A to point B. But sound is not an emission. Nothing is moving in the case of sound. When sound is generated, there is a disturbance, a perturbation of the medium, in this case nitrogen and oxygen. By the way, the speed of sound changes depending on the temperature, on the density of the air, whether it's at altitude, sea level, above sea level, below sea level. And this is, of course, the hysteresis of the nature of the perturbation that we call the speed of sound. But there's nothing being emitted or actually moving. It's the rate of induction of the disturbance of the medium. Let me repeat that. The rate of induction of the disturbance of the medium, or specifically the hysteresis of the medium, the hysteresis of air, and of course it changes just as light. It's quote-unquote the hysteresis of the rate of induction of light, which is no different. And by the way, this is why, wait for it, this is the reason why, it's a direct quote from Nikola Tesla. He said that light can be nothing other than a sound wave in the ether. Now, of course, there's no such thing as a wave. Waves are not things. Waves are what things do. Nikola Tesla specifically said those words. If you want me to give you exact quotation where he said it, I think he says it 2 different places, but you could find it on the internet too, is that light, just like sound, is not an emission. Yeah? It is a field perturbation of the medium. You cannot deny the ether. The ether is impossible to deny. However, they do try. These atomists, when they deny the ether, they must come up with a particle answer. And that particle answer is a virtual photon. That's what's being emitted by a magnet. Now, a magnet doesn't emit anything. Yeah? This self-canceling field of, because before a magnet becomes a magnet, it is quantitatively 100% identical. The only thing that defines a magnet is its qualitative nature has changed to an incommensurable field where everything is working in union, and therefore you actually have a field effect that is not additive but multiplicative, because nothing's been added to a magnet before it becomes a magnet, after it becomes a magnet. Its qualitative nature has changed, and therefore its field effect phenomena is now multiplicative. And when it becomes multiplicative, it becomes ab extra to the physical object itself. And the only way you can explain that, and they love to talk about virtual photons, is with the ether. Yeah. Around every quote-unquote pole, whether it be a north pole or a south pole, and magnet doesn't actually have poles. It actually has the inverse of counter space, which is the three-dimensional S-curve of a force vector that we call magnetism, the centrifugal divergence. Yes? So a magnet doesn't have poles. We don't have to discuss that. You have a vortex. You have the conjugate geometry of the hyperboloid and the torus, which are the negative images of one another. It doesn't matter if I'm looking at the top of this apple, which is a vortex, and of course the apple is a torus shape. You actually have this little vortex on the top. We have a vortex down here too, and everything is because people love to talk about ether. The YouTube and the internet loves to use the words ether vortex. Well, that sounds really mysterious and cool, and it does sound mysterious and cool. Everybody loves to say ether vortex. Ooh, sounds fascinating. Yeah, but since Mother Nature's a simple, hairy armpit chick with a hemp skirt and muddy feet and dreadlocks, the only thing we're saying when we say ether vortex is we're actually talking about a toroidal depression towards counter space. Yeah? Magnets, by the way, as I've said many, many times, do not accelerate towards one another. They accelerate towards the null pressure point between the two, and you can actually see this underneath the supercell or the ferrocell, doesn't matter what you want to call it. They're not accelerating towards one another. They're accelerating towards the lowest null point between the two in counter space. Yes? Mother Nature is really, 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 really simple. So ether vortex. There's no such thing as a virtual photon. I don't know if you're interested or not, but I'd like to make a really, I don't know if say long video, but an interesting video listing all the points where atomism cannot explain Mother Nature and natural phenomena. You can't never define a field with particles and virtual particles. Completely implied virtual particles don't even exist. You can never explain a field with atomism or quantum, because the root of quantum is quantity. They think everything is countable and quantifiable, but it's not. You cannot quantify a field. Sure we can. Maxwellian field equations say we can find a field with a given effect over a period of time with a vector. And then we can actually stick that in a little box and count them and stick them into our equations. Well, you can just kind of quantify anything, but a field cannot be quantifiable because it has no quantity. Its measure over a period of time with a vector and a given result, whether that be joules, watts, volts, amps, or so on and so forth, is undeniable, but that does not explain the field itself, and a field is an ether perturbation modality. So, wouldn't it be neat if you were taught this stuff in high school or college? Because it's true. This is not like my video, even though it is my video. This is how nature actually works. Yeah, that's how it actually works. Mother Nature doesn't have a bag of magic particles like trillions of little billiard balls inside of this giant sack like Santa Claus has. And everything in the universe are all these particles colliding, or they're conglomerating to make things like rocks and stones and human beings, and it doesn't work that way. Not only does it not work that way, it's completely illogically impossible. You can't explain gravity. And gravity, of course, is not an autonomous field modality. Gravity is just non-point source mutual mass acceleration of objects. The same thing we call magnetic attraction, which is not magnetism at all, is the exact same thing we call gravity. The only difference is their qualitative nature. The same distinction between a light bulb and a laser. 5-watt light bulb, 5-watt laser. They're radically different, but they're both light, and they're both 5 watts of energy, for example. The distinction is one is point source and the other one is non-point source. And that's the same distinction between so-called two magnets accelerating towards one another, which is not magnetic attraction. And they're not actually accelerating towards one another, because what's going on around a magnet? Magnet's not emitting anything. There's another misnomer. There's no such thing as magnetic attraction. A magnet is not emitting anything. What's occurring around it is a field depression, respectively the conjugate torus and the hyperboloid, both of which form a holos, or a hole, a unific hole, a conjugate geometry of force and motion, inertia and acceleration. And right around the center of it is the plane of inertia, which is where most life exists. Plane of inertia sits right there along the middle because that's the lowest pressure mediation between the centrifugal and the centripetal. Plane of inertia is fascinating. I could probably make 1,000 videos talking about the plane of inertia and its fascinating effects and how its geometry sits relational to the torus and the hyperboloid. I don't know if anybody would be interested in that. It'd probably bore the hell out of you. But these fascinating words of field theory like ether vortex. So what's an ether vortex? Well, it's just a spatial sink depression. It's a half of a torus right there. It's just like a spatial sink. Yeah, things vortices are right in there. Specifically, it's nothing more complicated than pressure mediation. Anyway, I hope I didn't make this video too esoteric. I didn't mean for it to be esoteric, but you know, that's for you to decide. I hope it illuminated you in one fashion or another, because Mother Nature is really, really simple. Explaining it is another matter, but hopefully I've achieved that to some degree, not just in this videos, but collaboratively amongst the other ones that have been made. Thank you.